Hello. In this video I want to talk to you about histograms, what they are and how vital they are for getting you the exposure you're looking for. This video is part of my technical fundamentals course in photography. Week by week I'm adding more and more to it to give you all the basic nuts and bolts you need to understand the technical bits of photography. I'm aiming to bring the videos out every Friday, and if you like what you're seeing, hit like, obviously subscribe if you want to make sure you get them every week, and do stick a comment below if you're stuck and want an answer to some question. I'll do my very best to answer it. There are also full transcripts of these videos available over at my blog at photosmudger.com. So, what's a histogram and how can they help you get a decent exposure? Everybody loves the fact that nowadays with digital cameras you can take a picture and instantly have a look at it on the back of the screen. You can find out whether you got the shot you wanted, captured the perfect moment, the perfect expression. You can also use that image to some extent to work out if your exposure was right or not, but you do have to be a little bit careful. Now, pretty much all decent cameras will also show you something called a histogram, as well as just the preview image. Exactly how you access it I couldn't tell you because of course every camera is different. It's a case of read the manual, but it should be pretty easy to find. Just play around with the options when you review images. This histogram looks a lot like a bar graph, like the sort of things you used to make back at school. And it's simply a map of how the tones in your image are distributed. And it's a much more accurate way of judging exposure than simply looking at the preview image. Now it'll look something like this, although this is obviously just an approximation. What you've got, like I say, is a bar graph. Along here, you've got the tones in your image, from shadows all the way up to highlights. And on this axis, on the y-axis of the graph, you've got the amount. So what we have here is a histogram showing a very average image, with most of the tones grouped around midtones, not many highlights, not many shadows. If this was an extremely dark image, we'd expect to see a big spike in the shadow end and not much in the midtones and highlights. And if it was a very bright image, we'd expect to see a big spike in the highlight, not much in the midtones and not much in the shadows. Easiest way to imagine it is think of those bar graphs you made at school. Along the bottom you'd have number of whatever. So you might have number of houses on my street, number of houses on this street, and you'd have the numbers going up the side. So you'd have 5 in this column, 10 in this column, and 5 in this column, and you create a curve like that. Okay? Think of it like a bar graph and you won't go far wrong. Now, one of the biggest advantages to looking at a histogram rather than just the preview image is that it is objective and accurate. The preview image can actually be very, very deceptive depending on what situation you're shooting in. This is usually, as is always the way, most obvious at extremes. Let's say you're shooting indoors in a very dimly lit situation, and then you take a picture and you look at the preview image and it looks absolutely fine. Now there's a decent chance that it's actually quite dark and underexposed, but because your LCD screen is so bright in relation to the dark environment you're in, to you it will look like, oh no, that's fine. But you'll probably find, and I know this from a lot of experience, that actually you're a bit underexposed. And the opposite is also true. An LCD screen might seem bright in a darkened room, but if you're outside shooting on a bright sunny day, that same LCD screen is very dim compared to the bright sunlight, and again it's very hard to really work out whether the exposure is right or not because you can't really make the image out enough. If you make sure to look at the histogram, you'll have a proper representation of where the tones are in your image, rather than just what you think might be right or what you want to be right. Now, as always, there's slightly more to it than what I've described so far. You may think that what you're after in every situation is a perfect curve like that, a mountain almost, with lots of midtones, a little bit of highlight, a little bit of shadow. Everything's great, that every image should try and mimic this. Well, no, not really. Only average shots with an average distribution of tones should look like this. If we take a look at this portrait of footballer Peter Crouch, for example, we can see that in fact the histogram is grouped massively down towards the shadow left-hand side end. That's because lots and lots and lots of the shot is made up of very, very dark tones, all that blackness in the background. That's the shot I wanted to create. Now imagine if instead that was more like a mountain, and those wonderful deep rich black tones were instead a kind of wishy-washy grey, the shot wouldn't have anywhere near as much impact, would it? There's enough light tones on Peter himself and on the spotlights in the ceiling that we can see what's happening, but I want the rest of the image to go dark. At the other end of the scale, this studio portrait of a poker professional is of course very, very pushed towards the right hand end when you look at the histogram. Okay, you've got so many tones that are around the highlight end, very, very little mid-tones and almost no shadow tone whatsoever, but that's absolutely fine because again, the image I was trying to create is of this person isolated in this white, clean, empty clinical environment. If those same white tones were in fact quite wishy-washy and grey, the image would have nowhere near as much impact. Okay, so don't think that this is the only histogram you're looking for. There is no harm sometimes in having a histogram that's pushed very far to the left if that's what suits the image you're after, or pushed very far to the right if that's what suits the image you're after. Reading and understanding histograms is actually quite a complex thing. You can in fact go into all three different colour channels with histograms, and there's a lot more subtleties to them than just being a simple bar graph. But for the sake of simplicity and not confusing you too much, what I've told you is pretty much all you need to know. One last little thing that's worth looking out for is something called clipping. Now you may occasionally see a histogram that looks like this, or looks like the opposite, where there's a straight line at the highlight end. What's happened here is that basically you've started to lose information in the image. In this case, because the image is too dark. If your graph of tones comes up against the dead end of either end of the graph, everything after this point, obviously you've lost information. So you can imagine this curve should perhaps continue and come down here. This is very much an underexposed image this histogram represents, and the opposite would be true if this curve were to go up this way and be cut off by the y-axis on this side. If you've got an image like that, like one of these histograms for example, from one of these shots, you are definitely going to be overexposed or underexposed. Now it might be that that's actually what you want for the shot, but if you see one of these and you think your image is probably okay, warning, you're probably quite wide of the mark in terms of the correct exposure, unless you're deliberately going for something really, really dark or really, really bright. So do look out for clipping like this. Okay, that is all the basics about histograms that I want to pass on. As I say, there are many more subtleties to it. It does get much more complex, but for the sake of a beginner's introduction guide, that would only confuse you. Just remember, you're better off relying on them than the preview image if you want to get a good idea of what your exposure is like. Next week, I'm going to talk about exposure compensation, exposure lock, and a couple of other last little facets before we wrap up everything to do with exposure and move on to other aspects of photography. As you know, check back every week as I'm putting new videos up. Like it if you like it, subscribe so you get notifications, stick a comment in, I'll try and answer as best as I can, and full transcripts are at photosmudger.com. Look forward to seeing you next week.